I'm going to keep it brief because I'm aware that we're behind time, and just sort of go through the basic concepts. It's important to emphasize that we work in a hospital that was built a long time ago with an old infrastructure. So whilst there are sort of ideal principles, you have to be able to adapt with and use what you've got. We've adopted a zoning approach that is quite widely used elsewhere. For COVID negative patients who are not suspected to have COVID, then they are sort of cohorted into normal wards and we continue our normal practice. However, I think it's very important to recognize that there will be patients who are infected with coronavirus who are within that group. Certainly at the Hammersmith, especially quite early on, we had a number of patients who tested positive, having spent quite a long period on the wards. And for that reason, it's really important to maintain the sort of basic infection control behaviours that are important throughout the hospital, and I'll come on to that later. Perhaps one of the most important aspects of the zoning is for the COVID suspected patients, because for them, we don't only need to account for the potential of them infecting other people, but we also need to protect them from becoming infected by coronavirus when they're in the hospital if they don't actually have the disease. And it's for that reason that patients who have suspected coronavirus have the highest priority for being isolated in side rooms. And that includes obviously separate bathroom and toilet facilities. And those patients in the side rooms are ideally located within a broader COVID positive zone. The COVID positive patients are cohorted within a zone which has to incorporate a sluice, the drugstore, toilets and washing facilities, a kitchen and other equipment that might be appropriate. So obviously for cardiology patients, we have identified pacemaker programmers that stay within the dirty zone, and also an echo bit of equipment. If at all possible, when you're trying to design the setup, it's a real advantage to have the original plans from estates, and we managed to get those, and it makes it a lot easier to create realistic plans that can then be used to communicate to the rest of the team. So taking the original plan, I've overlaid the basic structure and then gone on to create our sort of plan and zones for our particular area where we have the cath labs. So this shows the area in the Hammersmith Hospital where we've got 3 cath labs, A, B and D, where the patients who are having angioplasty come, and we also have the facility to do pacing. And what we've chosen to do is to have a so-called dirty lab, Lab D, and then the surrounding area to all be a COVID positive zone. We have got a one-way system, so staff entering the zone come in, put PPE on just outside the changing rooms, enter a sort of one-way, clearly signposted door, and come through into the zone, which includes showers, toilets, drug cupboard, and there's an associated kitchen. It doesn't have a sluice, but we are able to get around this because there are reasonable provisions of toilets, and we have got other facilities in place to get rid of the sort of dirty waste. So the idea, if possible, is to have a one-way system, and I think the other important aspect is to have a large area where you can actually take the things off. Taking the PPE off is actually requires more space and care in many ways than putting it on. And so that's where we have this area, and these dotted lines represent physical sort of plastic barriers that try and create a sort of de-escalation. So you take the PPE off, come in here, put alcohol gel on your hands, move through to the next stage before taking the masks off. Like I said at the beginning, we have to work with what we've got. So patients who are coming in are triaged, as Ricardo just explained. And if they go into the Lab D, then they may need to come out into an area while we decide what the most appropriate long-term place for them in the hospital is, and that's where we have this sort of orange zone, so sort of COVID suspected zone for these patients, which is really just a holding area while we decide what to do definitively. On our other wards, I think another aspect that is very helpful is to try and allow for flexibility. And if you're lucky enough to have a ward area with 2 entrances, then that again makes things easier. So on our wards, one of the plans that we're going to execute is to have a sort of variable red and green zone. So on this diagram, you can see that we've got 2 wards originally, A8 and A7 so-called, with 2 entrances. So a dirty entrance on the left and a clean entrance on the right. And then as we escalate, the dirty area can be changed in size until eventually we will be all sort of a COVID red zone, and we can then have 1 entrance and 1 exit. Going through to implementation, obviously one of the really important things is to try and communicate to the staff. It comes with a lot of anxiety. I've tried to emphasize that actually the areas where we are managing patients with known coronavirus might be one of the safer places to be, because we can take the necessary precautions, and in the green areas there will be patients who are COVID positive that we haven't recognized. It needs to be communicated to all staff, so not just the medical and nursing staff, but all of the people who work in sort of administration and the receptionists, cleaners and kitchen staff. And the other thing that's been mentioned by various people throughout the afternoon is behaviours. I mean, these are very difficult to change. It's taken many years to persuade people to wash their hands. Social distancing is not easy to do at work. The rooms are often not big enough. It requires continual effort, and effort that creates a bit of social embarrassment if you're telling your colleagues to stand away from you. No touching of face or hair, and no putting your phone to your face is something that's difficult to change. Everything on the ward in a red zone should be considered contaminated, and nothing should leave that zone unless it's appropriately bagged or decontaminated. And I've said it's very important to have the largest possible area for taking off the equipment. When preparing, it's a good idea to walk around the wards each day from the perspective of staff, where you're going to put the equipment on and take it off, and also from the perspective of patients and how the patient flow is going to work. And finally, make sure you do the signs a few days in advance. Adequate signage is important, because people will lag behind what's going on, and the wards will change quickly. Other issues that I haven't really touched on, so with CPAP patients, ideally they should be in negative pressure areas. Finding out how the air conditioning systems work in the hospital is something we've not been particularly successful with. Transportation, moving patients from one area to another is obviously fraught with problems, so you want to try and minimize transportation, and where it is necessary, think carefully about how you're going to actually get the patients through and clean up behind. And finally, rest areas and common rooms, lunch, all of these things are hazards where people may infect and cross-infect each other. So thank you, I will finish there.